I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. This upcoming fall will look a lot different than the flu season we're accustomed to in a world of COVID-19, monkeypox, and even the polio virus. With cooler temperatures approaching, officials are promoting booster shots and precautions, especially as students prepare to go back to school. Now, this comes as healthcare systems in Canada and the world are already overwhelmed and stretched beyond their limits. So how can you stay safe in a season of viruses? Well, joining us now to give us his input on how to live with monkeypox, polio, and COVID-19 is Dr. Jason Kindrachuk, assistant professor and virologist at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Kindrachuk, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
So, Doctor, I'm sure a lot of Canadians are feeling overwhelmed and potentially even concerned amid the prevalence of COVID, monkeypox, and potentially polio. So what would you say to them regarding these concerns?
Listen, I think the reality is we're all, I think, kind of spent at this point. We have to be appreciative of the fact that, listen, emerging infectious diseases have continued to rise in rates, in incidence, and in frequency for years now. So we aren't necessarily seeing something that's unprecedented. We are certainly hearing more about it. But we also have to keep perspective that many of these diseases are vaccine preventable. So we have the mechanisms to try and reduce rates of transmission in our communities. But we also have to enable people to be able to get access and message for people to be able to go and get those.
And is there a particular virus out of the three that Canadians should be most concerned about this upcoming season?
Yeah, listen, I think that COVID is the one that we're still overwhelmingly concerned about because of the fact that it's continued to change. It's continued to, to kind of evolve over time, just in regards to the new variants that have been presented. And we still don't have a complete handle yet on transmission in our community. So we are going to be battling that, and we're still learning about the virus in real time as well.
All right, Dr. Kindrachuk, let's talk a little bit about vaccines. So we know vaccine coverage for polio is relatively high in Canada, but monkeypox is quite new to rich countries. And as we mentioned, COVID continues to mutate into different variants. So how should Canadians approach vaccinations and boosters this upcoming season?
Yeah, listen, I think the reality is we are seeing what happens certainly when vaccine rates start to slip. That's been, I think, very much in our purview as we've watched polio the last while. We've seen what's happened with monkeypox, with not gaining control of monkeypox in endemic regions in Africa. We have, again, the tools to be able to get these under control and to try and get some foothold on severe disease in all of these cases. So I think for Canadians, it's important to continue to get good messaging, get good information in regards to vaccination, and maintain up-to-date vaccinations for you and your family.
And staying on the note of vaccinations, we know today the FDA authorized its first updated COVID boosters to target the newest variants. So tell us a little bit more about these new boosters. How resilient are they against these mutated virus variants?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Listen, I think we're still learning what the overall effectiveness is of these vaccines against the certainly the new strains or the new variants of COVID-19 that we've seen. We have to be appreciative that the vaccines we've already have continued to provide us protection against the most severe aspects of disease, regardless of what variant has been thrown at us. We've seen reductions in the ability to block infection. But that other part, that severe disease component, has maintained intact. So I think that's one thing important for us. So this may provide us with a boost with getting some handle on transmission, but we continue to have to evolve our strategy as the virus continues to change.
All right, Dr. Kindrachuk, what other steps can Canadians take other than vaccination to protect themselves in this world of viruses?
Yeah, listen, the most important thing that I think we need to get across to people is we know where the vast majority of emerging infectious diseases are emerging in regard to hotspots across the globe. We need to enable access to vaccines and therapeutics in those regions. We need to increase surveillance. We need to increase infrastructure. All of these things in a global community will ultimately have effects for us. So if we can get a foothold in those regions, we ultimately will reduce the burden across the globe.
And what are you watching for as we approach the autumn and winter seasons, Doctor?
Yeah, everything. Really watching what happens with monkeypox as we start to see some receding overall in cases. What happens? Will we start to see that cases pick up if people start to lose some of those societal changes that they've made to reduce infectious rates? Certainly, as we move into fall, what happens with COVID next? As kids go back to schools, we all go back to a more normal lifestyle, and we introduce the cold into all of this. What happens with those rates of infection? So I think we need to kind of wait a little bit with bated breath to see what happens, but also be as ready as we can to respond.
All right. Thank you again for another informative interview, Dr. Kindrachuk from the University of Manitoba.
Thank you.
All right, well, after the break, we're going to take a deeper look at harassment and threats directed against politicians, especially women and minorities. Our interview with Dr. Barbara Perry, director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, is coming up next. Stay tuned. A recent interaction involving Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland and a man in Alberta is the latest example of the growing issue of harassment and violence against politicians. A video circulating online over the weekend shows the finance minister being confronted by a man hurling profanity at her. This came as she arrived at the City Hall in Grand Prairie, Alberta. On Sunday, she recounted numerous incidents in which she said she was fearful. This includes a phone call from a man who said he knew where she lived and that she should, quote, watch out. The PM points out that this was not a one-time incident, but something that people in the public, particularly women and minorities, are having to deal with more and more. Well, joining us now to talk more on this is Dr. Barbara Perry, professor at Ontario Tech University and director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. Dr. Perry, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Good to be with you again.
So how do such incidents, including what happened to Ms. Freeland, contribute to the rise of extremism in Canada?
Well, I think it's a chicken and egg. I think that the rise of extremism has allowed this sort of narrative to flourish, that it's not just people who are formally affiliated with far-right groups who find themselves or feel themselves to be emboldened, but in fact, common citizens, everyday citizens that aren't necessarily affiliated. So that's, that's feeding into their narratives, but then that is reinforcing, I think, the strength of the far-right movement generally.
And going back to a press conference on Monday, we saw federal cabinet ministers saying such incidents are a threat to democracy. But what is the current state of democracy in Canada amid this growing issue of violence and harassment against politicians?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, if we look at the last election, the voter turnout was not great. So I think that's an indication. I think that there was just what were they calling it? The rage index that was just released in the last week or so that shows a lot of dissatisfaction with the state of government. And I think that we hear, in social media forums, a lot of distrust of public institutions, including politics and politicians. So I think that, we're at a different space than we've ever been in that respect. I think there is less legitimacy, less credibility on the part of many people in terms of the way that they view the government and their role. Some people feel left behind, as they say, by the government.
And what's interesting is that officials are highlighting that most of these incidents involve women, racialized people, and Indigenous people. So why do you think that is, Dr. Perry?
Yeah, and that's another piece of the threat to democracy. It is exclusionary. It's intended to silence these people. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we saw, Singh assailed earlier last year in Peterborough. We have seen this with politicians and journalists as well, people of color, women, who are seen to be, that's just one more indication of what's wrong with this society, with this culture, that they are also jumping the queue somehow, that they have stepped outside of the boundaries that are acceptable, and they need to be silenced again from their perspective. They need to be put back in those boxes that have been crafted for them. So it is a reaction not just to lack of faith in government, but also it's a reflection of misogyny. It's a reflection of the racism that's embedded in our society.
And what do we know so far about the demographics of the perpetrators of such violence and harassment in Canada?
Well, so far it looks as if it is predominantly white men, and not necessarily young white men. When we think about the far right, when we think about extremists, I think we think that is a youth movement. It's really not. We're seeing, I think, much more in the way of middle-aged and older individuals who are being drawn into these same sorts of narratives and ideologies and acting on them in this way. And so this is who we're seeing is that demographic, middle class, working class, middle class, white men predominantly.
And I guess the big question here would be if this is an issue that our leaders or Canadians themselves need to address, Dr. Perry. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, that's part of the problem, is that our political leaders are also engaging in some of this polarizing speech. So they're certainly not helping. I think they are exacerbating the problem in many respects. So I think that, we do have to hold those leaders accountable and demand that they not only speak out when they see these sorts of incidents, but also themselves refrain from language that language that is polarizing in any way, because that just further aggravates the grievances and especially the concerns around democracy and the role of the government.
All right, Dr. Barbara Perry, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
It's good to be with you.
When we come back from the break, we'll be turning to the continued fallout at Hockey Canada amid multiple sexual assault scandals. Our interview with Professor Laurel Walczak is coming up next. As the fallout from a series of sexual assault scandals involving Hockey Canada continues, one advocate says the organization isn't listening. Retired NHL player Sheldon Kennedy is a fierce advocate for sexual abuse survivors, and he is repeating his call for a leadership change. His comments came after the organization's board of directors said it's supporting the executive team despite calls for leadership to resign. Hockey Canada has been under intense scrutiny for its handling of sexual assault allegations against members of previous men's junior teams. However, Laurel Walczak, an expert on sport media and sport business, says this is not even the tip of the iceberg. Well, Professor Walczak from the Global Experiential Sport Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University joins us now. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Great, thanks for having me.
All right, so the latest developments in this case saw Hockey Canada's board of directors supporting the executive team. So what sort of message is this organization putting out amid this investigation?
Well, this is a very big question, because I think that they need to look at how each member is complicit. What was their role in leading up to this, and the executive team and the current CEO? And I don't believe right now, the way that things exist, even with their action plan in place, that they really understand what needs to be changed. And this is a culture change that's going to take time, and it starts at the top.
And on that note of culture change, it was revealed that in addition to the sexual assault cases dating back to 2003 and 2018, Hockey Canada paid over $8.9 million for sexual abuse settlements to 21 complainants. And this dates back all the way back to 1989. So why hasn't there been a change to this toxic culture yet?
This is frightening. This is absolutely frightening. And this all comes down to accountability. It comes down to denial, the bystander effect. One of the things that we said in the letter is that this is passive aggressive, and the fact that they're in denial. So, they have not been accountable to date. We've not been seeing the transparency that we need to see with this national sport organization. They've been able to use the funding in a way that, let's say, has been under the radar, for lack of better words. And the very fact that they have not been accountable by the government, and it has gotten past the government as well. The one thing that I would definitely say is that we've been saying this repeatedly as researchers, and for someone that has also worked in the hockey space, this is a problem that all of a sudden has surfaced and exposed, and we're going to see more of this. And if it wasn't exposed and it hadn't surfaced, would we still be where we are, where we were before this all came to fruition with Hockey Canada, and showing that they were actually hiding this and making settlements? The problems are not rare. I don't like the way that this is being framed, and either do we in the letter. We need to demonstrate that this is widespread.
And on the note of accountability, what do we know so far about the repercussions that players or coaches that were subject to these sexual abuse cases, what did they face?
Yeah, this is horrible, because this is where fear comes into play, where psychological effect comes into play. Players could be ostracized, shunned, alienated. This is the whole point of exclusion. And there are so many pressures to conform. And if they don't conform, then what happens to them? They could become, as I said, ostracized. And the anxiety and the psychological trauma that exists with these players is so unfair. And, we think about this from the standpoint of what we want to do in the pyramid of hockey is we build the grassroots and we want to win at, international levels. But at the same time, maybe we're actually not having the best players in place because some of those players have already been ostracized. And I think the very fact that there's this general exclusion that exists is frightening, and it's so unfair, and it totally negatively impacts the participation level in hockey. People don't want to come forward, and they're fearful to come forward.
So what needs to be done to address this toxic culture that is not only apparent in Hockey Canada, but as you say, in overall sport in Canada? So what are some realistic steps that officials should take here?
Well, the first and foremost, I like the fact that they're doing a review, not only on the action plan, but on the governance. I think all, not just Hockey Canada, but I'm going to use the word all here, sort of an all or nothing. Sport governance really needs to be reviewed in our country. There's a researcher, George Cunningham, that talks about deinstitutionalizing the institution. And this Hockey Canada institution needs to be deinstitutionalized. And in an effort to be able to change the culture, we need to identify the problems.
Coming up after the break, we'll take a look at the cost of climate disasters to the Canadian economy. Our interview with Zuliana Mawani from GHD coming up next. A climate-based analysis called Aquanomics was released on Monday. It is estimating that floods, droughts, and major storms that wash out highways, damage buildings, and affect power grids could cost the Canadian economy $139 billion over the next 30 years. The report is by global engineering and architecture services firm GHD, and it takes into account the loss of economic productivity, the shocks to the system when it comes to supply chain prices. The report predicts that manufacturing and distribution will take the biggest hit from water-related climate disasters. It is warning governments and businesses that they need to become more resilient and use data systems and sensors to help predict problems. Well, with us now to talk more on this is Ms. Zuliana Mawani, Water and Wastewater Operations Lead for GHD in Canada. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
So we gave a brief overview in our intro, but what would you say are the major findings of this study?
So the major findings were that droughts, floods, and storms could result in huge losses over in excess of $100 billion to the Canadian GDP. We're looking between 2022 and 2050. So that's about 0.2% per annum in the five major sectors that we looked at. Flooding alone, we're saying, will cost the Canadian economy $30 billion in the years leading up to 2050 and makes up most of the direct loss.
Some very concerning numbers there. So tell us a little bit more about why GHD decided to conduct this survey in the first place.
Well, we all know that we're seeing and continue to see the impacts of climate change and water-related impacts in particular. We saw the direct impacts of flooding last year in the Pacific Northwest. And aside from displacing people and direct damage to infrastructure, there's also the major impact to transportation corridors and shipping routes. And I'm sure many of us wondered what the overall economic impact was. With Aquanomics, we really wanted to take a step further to look at the overall impact to our economy.
And can you tell us a little bit more about that for some perspective and clarity for our viewers? Tell us a little bit more about how water-related disasters can impact the economy in terms of cost.
Sure. So we looked at five major sectors. So agriculture, banking and insurance, energy and utility, and fast-moving consumer goods and retail. And then, as you mentioned, the largest impact that we were seeing is from manufacturing and distribution. So that's where I'll start. So of the 9 countries that we looked at, we found that $4.2 trillion in losses by 2050 are expected in just this sector alone. And if you think about it, direct impacts to the manufacturing and distribution sector would be, water scarcity restricts industrial production processes. Flooding and storms can damage assets and energy production. And then we have our indirect impacts, which is really the crux of the Aquanomics report. When you think about distribution of goods, drought interrupts waterborne transportation. And we're seeing this in Europe right now at the Rhine River, where water levels are impacting shipping routes. Floodings and storms can impact road and rail trans infrastructure, as we saw last fall in Vancouver, where torrential rain in BC triggered major floodings and shutdowns.
All right, ma'am, just about 2 minutes left here. So let's talk about the solutions. So the report is urging governments and businesses to become more resilient. What would that look like?
So 3 areas where the solutions need to be focused. So we need to adapt, so that's building future resilience into new projects. We need to optimize, so get the most out of the infrastructure we have today. And then we need to prioritize, and predictability comes with that.
All right, and tell us a little bit more about these data systems and sensors to help predict these problems. How would they help in this situation?
So it comes with the prioritize piece. So it helps us, smart devices and sensors allow utilities to monitor resilience within the system in real time. So then they can focus their attention where it needs to be focused, to prioritize efforts and be ready when the time comes.
All right, Ms. Mawani, what would you say is this report's biggest message or takeaway here?
I think the biggest message that we can take away is that, we're all seeing and will continue to see the impacts of climate change. By adapting, optimizing, and prioritizing resiliency in our infrastructure, we can be prepared.
And where can our viewers go to learn a little bit more about this study?
You can go to aquanomics.ghd.com.
All right, Ms. Zulania Mawani, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. For more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and now TikTok for updates. Thanks for joining us again on Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again next time. Have a great weekend.